This subject is really stupid, but really important, it seems. So I just wanted to talk about what I mean when I speak of capitalism in my previous videos and how it relates to left libertarianism. As flagrantly offbeat as Springtime of Nations' response to me was, it did contain a nugget of truth that I think I should explain better than in my ad hoc response. Unfortunately, this is mainly just quibbling over definitions and not about Josiah Warren and Stephen Pearl Andrews. Definitions can be important for left libertarians since we occupy a pretty unique space in the political spectrum, but if you don't care about this type of thing, then I strongly advise you just skip this video. If you're familiar with the three definitions of capitalism introduced by Gary Chartier, then you know the specifics of those definitions aren't super important. The three capitalisms don't have a precise definition exactly, they are often described in different ways. But the important part is that capitalism 1 is a free market and capitalism 3 is the socialist critique of capitalism that developed from the 19th century. This is mainly because what their purpose is to juxtapose the liberal conception of capitalism as a free market and the socialist critique of capitalism as a system of exploitation or class antagonism. Just to illustrate how the specifics aren't super important in the context that they're in and that there's no hard definition for them. Chartier first outlined capitalisms 1 and 3 as Capitalism 1, an economic system that features property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services, and Capitalism 3 as rule of workplaces, society, and if there is one, a state, by capitalists, that is, by a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. And there is no shortage of variation in the capitalism theories that Johnson tries to build upon. Notice that it's the same capitalism theory that Gary Chartier used, but there is much more information added to it. Capitalism 3 as the wage labor system. Capitalism has also been used to refer to a specific form of labor market or a distinctive pattern of conditions facing ordinary working people, one in which the predominant form of economic activity is production of goods or the performance of services in the workplace that are owned and managed not by the people doing the work on the line, but by an outside boss. In the third sense, you have capitalism when most workers are working for someone else in return for a wage, because access to most of the important factors of production is mediated through a business class, with the businessmen and not the workers holding legal titles to the business, the tools and facilities that make the shop run, and the residual profits that accrue to the business. Workplaces are, as a result, typically organized in a hierarchical fashion, with the boss exercising a great deal of discretion over employees, who are generally much more dependent on keeping the job than the boss is on keeping any one worker. This sense is most commonly seen in the Marxian writings and in older writings of the radical left, including a great deal of pro-market writing from anarchists such as Benjamin Tucker and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. These are just two examples of formulation of the capitalist system. Again, these formulations of the same capitalism, the capitalism that is congruent with Proudhon, Marx, and Tucker. But again, they have very different descriptions. In the context in which the three capitalisms have been formulated, it serves as tools for anti capitalist libertarians to distinguish concepts that make conversations easier. And in my video on why free market capitalism is oxymoronic, I cited a version of capitalism theory by Charles Johnson who specifically emphasized class relationship in production and wage labor and did not explicitly mention exploitation, otherwise known as profit by individualist anarchists. What does not follow from this is that I think exploitation isn't a prerequisite for capitalism. There are a lot of parts of capitalism that do not show themselves in the definition provided, specifically to outline class relations in production. For example, most people, including me, would likely agree that wage labor and private ownership is necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition for capitalism. There are a lot of things integral to capitalism that I didn't mention in the video. Things like capital accumulation, prices, commodity exchange, and the relevant part here, profit generation. Even parts like Capitalism 1 are necessary for a more complete definition of Capitalism 3, things such as markets. These are all part of the capitalist system. A better, more complete definition of Capitalism 3 and capitalism in general, in my opinion, would be something like the socio-economic system where social relations are based on commodities for exchange, in particular, private ownership of the means of production and on the exploitation of wage labor. This definition is the Marxian idea merely represented insufficiently by Johnson and Chartier, and illustrates the complete idea of capitalism better and more concisely than my emphasis on class relations or whether capitalists have power or not in the case of Chartier. It is also derived from what Tucker called, quote, one of the most masterly expositions of the infamous nature and office of capital ever put into print. so it seems fitting in this context. Repeating this definition in every video would be redundant, and any alterations to serve a point will inevitably result in some misunderstanding, like what happened in Springtime of Nations' response. So if you care what I mean when I say capitalism, then here's exactly what I mean, unless I say otherwise. The point of my usage in my video on why free market capitalism is oxymoronic is to show the historical development of the wage system, not to be confused with wage labor per se. Market anarchists, including myself, have no qualms with including non exploitative wage labor as part of our anarchic vision, and believe any coercive and exploitative aspects of such a transaction is due to the state and its upheld monopolists. The characterization of capitalism as a class basis is precisely the relevant part that I wanted to tackle in the video, as it directly relates to the artificial dominance of the wage system and the political supremacy of capitalists that was produced by centuries of state justification. The sequel to that video, if or when I get around to making it, is on why free markets inevitably see the realization of the cost principle, or why the natural wage of labor is its product. Stay tuned if you're interested in that. But back to Springtime of Nations video. I know I said in the last video that it would be the last time I speak on the topic, but new information on that video came out, and I think it deserves a response to correctly finish up my thoughts on the subject, especially since it involves an implicit attack on the modern mutualist connections to our mutualist past. He said the point of the video was to claim that modern mutualists are different from old mutualists, and that we see the problem with capitalism being workplace organization in and of itself, rather than the exploitation usually accompanying such arrangements. They state on Twitter that I think the older mutualists like Warren, Andrews, and Tucker thought the problem with capitalism was the existence of profit, and that modern mutualists like yourself, Wilbur, and Carson think the main problem is workplace organization, and this difference is reflected in your definition. While this is slightly more interesting to talk about than a pissing match about definitions and how they apply to dead people, especially when those dead people align with the socialist side, we have both acknowledged profit generation as a necessary condition of capitalism in the leftist sense in some way or another, implicitly or explicitly. I referenced this explicitly in my chosen definition and citation for what capitalism is in my first video, which was a direct response to his magnum opus. So if his response was an attempt at a gotcha, I think it falls short. And do you remember when I mentioned the wage system was different from wage labor? Dyer D. Loom explains it this way. When the producer has all he produces under equitable distribution, when all the necessary outlay to facilitate exchange will be limited to one item, cost, the bottom drops out of the wage system as an enforced condition. Employees would be mainly cooperators, but it does not follow that there would be no wages paid for services, for undoubtedly it will always exist. The abolition of the wage system is the removal of the causes which render it both a necessary and a subservient condition, as the introduction of the superior facilities for light may be said to have abolished candles and pine knots. I am not fond of the employer-employee dichotomy, but I as well do not wish to enforce my vision of cooperative self-employment or peer-to-peer production on those who simply want to work for a wage. Wage labor would exist in market anarchism, and that is good as long as there's no systemic exploitation or coercion involved. As Loom has said, I think mutualist economics will look hugely different from where we are now, and I think progress will move us towards a way more fluid and horizontalist anarchy, and I think that's a good thing. We should also understand that people like Benjamin Tucker and Stephen Pearl Andrews had very individual projects, and generalizing the individualist movement as such obfuscates the relationships with one another. Something like Andrews' pantarchy and universology are pretty different from Tucker's plumbline individualism. Point being, the individualist movement had a plethora of various projects that aren't easily generalizable under the term mutualism. Even things like the cost principle are tackled at very different angles by Andrews and Tucker. I can't speak on behalf of Carson or Wilbur, but I can pull from studies in mutualist political economy that disprove Springtime of Nations' allegation. For example, looking at this passage, we find that Carson's concern is, in fact, on exploitation. That throughout history, the state has been a means by which the producing classes were robbed of their produce in order to support an idle ruling class. Without state intervention in the marketplace, the natural wage of labor would be its product. It is statism that is the root of all the exploitative features of capitalism. Capitalism indeed only exists to the extent that the principles of free exchange are violated, free market capitalism is an oxymoron. Where the emphasis is on is exploitation, as the natural wage of labor is its product. And without exploitation, there really isn't any capitalism to speak of. A little more humorous section dealing with wage labor is this: that apparently the recipe for a free market, as the average vulgar libertarian uses the term, is as follows. First, steal the land from the producing classes by state fiat and turn them into wage laborers. Then, two, by state terror, prevent them from moving about in search of higher wages or organizing to increase their bargaining strength. And three, finally convince them that their subsistence wages reflects the marginal productivity of labor in a free market. In this, we basically find a mirror of Loome's argument against the wage system. Wage labor is wrong in the current system because it is exploitative and there is coercion funneling people into it. Although I do think wage labor is a system that is not desirable, and there are better ways to organize production. Whatever critique this may be, it is undoubtedly secondary to the fact that it is both one, exploitative, and two, coercive in the status quo. I very much agree with Voltaire de Cleyre's characterization of the individualists that those who hold to the individualist tradition of political economy are firm in the idea that the system of employer and employed, buying and selling, banking, and all the other essential institutions of commercialism centered upon private property are in themselves good and are rendered vicious merely by the interference of the state. In fact, this analysis is not unique to the individualists per se. We find people like Kropotkin basically echoing the individualist critique in his Encyclopedia Britannica entry for anarchism. As to their economical conceptions, the anarchists, in common with all socialists, of whom they constitute the left wing, maintain that the now prevailing system of private ownership in land and our capitalist production for the sake of profits represents a monopoly which runs against both the principles of justice and the dictates of utility. The anarchists consider the wage system and capitalist production altogether as an obstacle to progress, but they point out also that the state was and continues to be the chief instrument for permitting the few to monopolize the land, and the capitalists to appropriate for themselves a quite disproportionate share of the yearly accumulated surplus of production. Consequently, while combating the present monopolization of land and capitalism altogether, the anarchists combat with the same energy the state as the main support of that system. Although Kropotkin seems to use the wage system synonymously with wage labor, the rest of the statement that it is the state that allows landlords to monopolize the land and the capitalists to monopolize their profits may as well be directly pulled from our friendly neighborhood individualists. The method of dismantling capitalism from both market anarchist and social anarchist perspectives is to dismantle the state. In fact, I would go so far as to say that most social anarchists would not have as much qualms about wage labor if it did not coincide with unequal power relations as is done in the status quo. Wage labor is not criticized because it is wage labor. Exploitation is probably the most important critique of the socialists, so much so that Tucker chose to simply define socialism as an anti usury movement. So, there you go. That is my response to the allegations of Springtime of Nations that I differ on my opinions on wage labor from the mutualists of the past. Consider this an addendum to Mutualcast rather than a separate video on this subject, because I feel like I'm mainly just reorganizing my thoughts I had in that video, so it's just an extension. Thank you for watching, and if you're interested in more Mutual's content, then you should make sure to subscribe. I have a lot planned for this channel.